and welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss the interesting facts about each species and debate which one we think is the best. Of course, we think all marine mammals are awesome. This is just our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy this series, and if you want to hear about a particular marine mammal, let us know in the comments. And without further ado, welcome to the next PacMam podcast. This week is another Marine Mammal Highlights, and this week, instead of doing individual species, we're doing another one of those where we talk about more of a topic rather than a specific species. We're going to be talking about dolphin intelligence, and cetacean and marine mammal intelligence, I guess. You often hear, you just say dolphin intelligence, but we're talking about all of them, different aspects of it. So I'm Cindy, and I'm going to be talking about the dolphin, specifically dolphin intelligence, and the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Laboratory in Hawaii. Super cool.
Very cool. I'm Kat, and I'm going to be talking about seal and sea lion intelligence, and specifically related to learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Trevor, and I will be talking about the aspect of tool use in marine mammals, which is
Very cool.
showing how smart they can be with their resources.
Right, and the fact that tool use is not everywhere in the mammal kingdom, in the mammal area. So I'm going to start off, and this is I'm just excited about this episode because I love talking about what they've learned at Koala Basin. And so Koala Basin Marine Mammal Laboratory is in Hawaii, and it was founded by Dr. Lou Herman, who passed away in 2016. Lou Herman, I mean, he is kind of like the father of dolphin cognition. For example, in 2006, he retired around then. The Encyclopedia of Linguistics said he and his team are responsible for, quote, virtually all of that is currently known and accepted, end quote, about dolphins' ability to understand syntax and semantics and the parts of critical language.
Wow.
So that's a lot. So they basically had captive dolphins, and they did a lot of different experiments looking at trying to see how they learn and how well can they learn, and in a lot of ways comparing them to chimpanzees, because that's our main, what's the word?
Context?
Main context, but our main, the only other one that we know of that's like really smart, close to people, basically.
Also one of the only ones that we've really been able to study.
Right.
Yeah.
And that brings up a good point about this. It's like, how do you study this in language in dolphins that don't speak the same language that we do, and also don't have hands to be able to do like sign language? Like, how do you communicate with that? And so that's what is kind of really interesting about how they figured out how to learn all this stuff from these dolphins. So basically, the end story is that they showed that dolphins are what they call cognitive cousins to chimpanzees, right? So they, in many ways, can do the same things that chimpanzees can do, and in one case, can actually do it better than chimpanzees. And so this one is that the dolphins are able to understand gesture language through the TV the first time they ever saw it. So with chimpanzees, you could teach them that the person on the TV was the same as the trainer that in real life. But with dolphins, they're just like, oh yeah, dude, that's guy on this little weird square thingy, but it's the trainer. I know what to do. So that was really interesting. That's they're better than chimpanzees. I mean, I think they're better than chimpanzees anyway, but that's my own thing. But there are so many things that they learned at this. We can't really talk about all of them, but we'll talk about a few more in depth, and then some other ones just kind of saying what happened. But they basically had these two dolphins, and there's some history there. They had two dolphins, and then they have another two dolphins, but basically at any given time, they had two dolphins that they were working with. And within 3 years, they were able to teach these dolphins 24 words. And they would basically, they knew, like bonobos, which is another not chimp. I'm not going to call it a chimp because a chimpanzee is different.
Ape.
Ape, yeah, right, ape. That they know the meaning of words by either a sound or a symbol. And they're able to know the syntax. And so this is one of the coolest things about this whole thing is that, okay, so you can teach different animals symbols for different objects, right? You can teach a dog to go fetch a certain thing. But what the dolphins can do is that they understand the syntax, which is the order of the words. So take the ball to the hoop is different than take the hoop to the ball. And so the fact that they could understand that, it's just another level of intelligence to be able to understand those, that the order of the words means something different. They were able to understand abstract meaning of things. So you could tell them something that doesn't really mean anything to them, and they could apply, like, oh, this means that. Weird people, whatever you're saying, I don't care, but I get what you're saying. They could differentiate left and right, which may seem something simple, but a lot of animals can't do that. Another thing that chimps can't do is understand when humans gesture by pointing. So if you point over so if you point over in this direction, chimps are not going to connect that you're pointing to something over there. But the dolphins were able to do that. And what's really interesting is that they were able to do two. So if they pointed to the surfboard and then they pointed to the hoop and then said fetch, the dolphin would know to take the surfboard to the hoop and fetch the surfboard and go to the hoop.
So it's again, it's that ability to like piece together the bits of information to make a coherent context.
Right, exactly. So they did sign language when they're teaching all these words. They use sign language. So again, just off that basis, you're talking with the dolphin that is, speaks a different language, and then you're teaching it kind of a third language because you're teaching it sign language, or making gestures to apply to specific objects or things. So they're able to understand that. Especially, that's also really important because they're able to understand our hand language when they don't have hands. So they wouldn't be able to, say, oh, this is what they're doing. Like that, it takes another level of intelligence to be like, oh, I understand what these weird appendages are on these people and what they're doing and putting together. The other really cool thing, so they were able to learn up to 5-word sentences. And the other really cool thing that I like to talk about is the fact that they can use, so they use echolocation to see underwater, right, with sound. And then they also have very good eyesight, most dolphin species, except for the river dolphins, which we have talked about in another podcast.
Which I will also, I will also mention them later in this podcast.
Oh, excellent. So they are able to detect, their echolocation is great, right? We talked about that before too, where they can see through sand, which is not something our sonar can do. But they can detect the shape, the distance, the size, and the solidity of an object. So whether something like a PVC pipe is filled with sand or it's filled with air or water, or something different. But what's really cool is, so what they did is that they would have the dolphins go underwater and they'd echolocate on an object in this little like case or whatever. And then they would bring it back up to the top, and then they would say, okay, is this, and above water echolocation doesn't work. So they have to be using their eyes at this point. And when they went below the water, they had goggles to put over the dolphin's eyes so that they knew that they were using the echolocation, not their eyes, to look at it. But when they went above the water, they almost 100% of the time could match whatever object was that they echolocated on with the object that they're seeing with their eyes.
Very cool. So again, like being able to link those two sensory inputs and actually make a mental picture, quote unquote, with your echolocation, and then translate that into a visual picture that you're then seeing.
Exactly. And so that kind of also showed us how the echolocation works, that they are literally making a picture with sound, and then they can match that picture. I'd really be interested to know exactly what does that picture look like in their brain? Is it like exactly like what it looks like, or is it like this abstract thing that they can figure out?
Well, I guess like if you're looking at like a depth sounder or something, even just on like a boat that has, and you have the layers of fish underneath your boat, like you can actually see the quote unquote, like at least the overall shape of the fish.
Right. Yeah.
Using that sonar. So, I mean, you can to some degree, just even with our basic technology compared to their incredibly, fine-tuned echolocation.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if they specifically found, I don't know the details of all the experiments that they did, but I would assume that if it had the same shape, they could actually tell the different density as well. Although that might only be with echolocation and not the sight.
Right, I don't know.
So, anyway.
Good question though.
Yeah, either way, pretty cool. And the other thing, when they were doing these experiments, they would have the people wear the goggles, so that when they're doing their gestures and telling the dolphin what to do, there would be no bias in that the dolphins could see like, oh, bring the hoop to the person or something, and your eyes would give away what you want the dolphin to do, and they're reading that instead of understanding the language. So I think that's really important to know, is that they did set these experiments up very well, so they were answering the question they were asking about what these dolphins could do, instead of having something else, like the Hans, the clever horse. Did you ever hear that story?
Oh yeah,
where the horse could supposedly count, and
it would tap its hoof to count up the numbers.
Right, he would the guy would be like, "What's 4 + 5?" And he would count to 9. And I don't even think that the owner even kind of knew he was doing it, but he would basically, the horse would watch the owner, and then as soon as he got to the right number, and the owner would be like, "That's great," and then he'd be like, "Oh, good, I'm done." So the horse couldn't actually count, but it was just really good at observation, which is another type
also
of
pretty intelligent to be able to pick up on the cues, just even if it's emotional cues, that you also intelligently know that you achieved the goal.
Exactly. And so that goes into, kind of what we're talking about, like how do we apply intelligence? And we're going to talk about that more, especially with Trevor's part. But like, what does that intelligence mean? How do we apply what we think is intelligence to an intelligence of another animal that doesn't have hands, has hooves, has flippers, or whatever, lives in a different area? That they may be very intelligent, but just in a very different way than we're used to thinking about it.
Right.
We're so used to comparing our knowledge to other animals that have vastly different brains, and
Exactly.
what could be smart here we don't think it is, because it's not the same way we think.
Right. And what's smart in the ocean environment is very different than what's smart in human society.
How do you quantify smart?
Exactly. Right. And we even have a trouble with that with humans. Like how do you really measure exactly what is smart? Someone could be super intelligent but be socially not very smart, and vice versa. So what that level of intelligence, does an IQ test really tell you how smart you are, or does it test a specific portion of how smart you are?
Right. Yeah. So I guess just for context for this entire podcast, that's good to bear in mind that we are talking about human measured levels of intelligence in marine mammals, not necessarily, we don't have the capability really to know how intelligent they are, compared to their peers. Like we can't measure that because we don't understand fully what intelligence means to a dolphin versus a seal versus an otter versus,
Right. My favorite, one of my favorite it's an article from The Onion where it says like, wow, dolphins are supposed to be super intelligent. But when we put them on land, all they do is flop around and flail. Like, so again, it's putting them in this foreign environment and being like, well, you're so stupid because you can't do anything. Well, let's put a human in the water and being chased by a shark and see what happens.
I think my favorite one is there's a comic somewhere and it's a bunch of animals and there goes my dog. A bunch of animals and they're all taking the same test, which is climb that tree, and there's like an elephant, a monkey, and a fish.
All right.
That's measuring it.
Which one's going to be able to climb the tree? Yeah. Although the elephant could just knock down the tree and then climb it, I guess.
There you go.
But yeah, that's a great example of like, okay, you're testing that intelligence of that animal. Well, it's the physical ability of the animal, not the intelligence that is able to do that. So you have to differentiate those. A few other things that were of note, they could detect fine discrimination of auditory frequencies. So they're just really able to tell like very short and small differences in the size and the length of that. They have well-developed short-term memory for both auditory, hearing and visual stuff. They are short-tempered, so when they're wrong, they get really upset, and they relish in being right because they also usually get fish for that. So I thought that was kind of fun because it shows, those are my dogs, that there's emotion, if you want to put that out there. You always have to be careful.
There's
about
reaction.
Anthropomorphizing,
even if you don't
react to how well they did or did not do.
Right.
Which is going to be really frustrating if you don't quite understand exactly what you're doing. And in the beginning of these experiments, that's what happens, right? You're teaching them what you are asking. So you're going to get it wrong a few times until you figure out what that question actually is. So that's going to be really frustrating to begin with. Okay, I know I'm supposed to do something, but I don't know what. And we actually did that. I went to a training workshop where we learned how to do some, dolphin training, like how we would teach a dolphin a new behavior. And we had to do it in a circle, and one person was the trainer and one person was the dolphin. And so basically every time you did something kind of close to what the person wanted you to do, you got to click, but you don't know exactly what you just did was supposed to be towards that. So like you're sitting there just trying to figure out, okay, I did this, click. I go to the right, no click. Okay, go to the left, click. Okay, so I'm going to go to the left, and then slowly building up to figure out exactly what the behavior is that you were supposed to do. So it's really interesting. A couple other things, they could mimic novel sounds and the behavior of dolphins and humans, which is a unique dual ability to do that for both sound and visual. And they understood what imitate means. So you could say, imitate this person, and they would go, oh, okay. And I have a funny story about that. I went to the Dolphin Research Center and got to hang out with the dolphins down there, and in the Keys, and one was in the water, and they're like, okay, do something and the dolphin will imitate you. So they're like, imitate Cindy. So I went over and I dove down with my head and had my feet sticking out of the water, but I didn't do it very well. So my feet were like tilted to the side. So when the dolphin went and did it, it didn't just do a regular tail stand. It was like, oh, well, she's doing this. So that's what I'm going to do.
Very specific.
Very specific. I'm doing exactly what she did. And they understood the concept of behavioral synchrony for behaviors directed by the trainer and self-directed. So they can, dolphins are very good at synchronous behavior. But the fact that the trainer would say, you two go do that. And they knew that, okay, we're both going to go do a backflip right now in tandem, which is pretty cool. They are self-aware. And so we talked about in one way they do self-aware is if they, put a mark on the body and then go look at a mirror test and see if the animal looks to see where you put that mark. But there's other ways to detect that. They did the awareness of their recent behavior. So they would tell them repeat. And so they would have to know, oh, I just did this. So that's what they want me to do again. So awareness of their own behavior. And then awareness of their own body parts when symbolically referenced. So what they did is they gave gestures to dorsal fin, pec fin, a fluke, rostrum, head. And so then they were able to say like ball, head, touch, or whatever. And so then they would go, oh, I'm supposed to go over to the ball and touch it with my head. So they could understand, again, another level of that. You're not pointing to each body part and saying, go touch that. You're saying this abstract gesture means this body part.
Right.
And then do something with it. And the last thing I'll probably touch on here, which is really interesting, is that they could tell them, going back to the syntax, knowing the order of the words, they could understand anomalous sentences. So where the syntax is correct, but it was an impossible task. So for example, take the window to the surfboard. So it would be surfboard window fetch. You can't take the window out of the tank, right? It's impossible. You can't move it. Yeah. So either the dolphin would just sit there and be like,
really? Probably just like, really, dude?
Right. Like, that's dumb. Why are you asking me to do that? Or what's interesting is they would substitute an action that was like that. So instead of a window, they'd bring something else to the surfboard, but they would never actually try to move the immovable object. So they were trying to be like, okay, I'm trying to make you happy. You want me to do something, but I can't do that. So here's this.
Right, because they still want the fish. At the end of the day, they still want to do the task because they get rewarded for it.
Right, and up to then, like, I'm supposed to do a task. Like, is the answer no? Do I still get a fish if my answer is no? No. Yeah, and then they also understood grammar. Well, we knew that, but they had intrinsic knowledge of grammar structure, which is the first demonstration of this in a language tutored animal. So person, ball, hoop, fetch. Usually it would be like person, hoop, fetch would mean bring the hoop to the person. But when there's three things in there, you could have bring the ball to the person, bring the hoop to the person, or bring the hoop to the ball. All three of those would be in that grammatically kind of incorrect, or not incorrect, but just not clear.
Confusing. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so there were, there's three different ways to do it. So they usually did one, picked one of those and say, well, I can do this one, here you go. But still, to understand, like, instead of it just being like a nonsense sentence, they're just like, I have no idea. They were able to pick out and say, like, well, I can do this one, and that fulfills part of the sentence. So then I'm going to go ahead and do that.
Interesting.
So, like I said, there's so much that they did, and there's so many papers out, and it's mind-blowing what they were able to learn from just those two dolphins for the last I think the institute was going for about 34 years. And basically, like I said, almost everything that we know about dolphin intelligence, especially in terms of language, is with the Koala Basin. And I want to leave with a quote that Lou Herman said, that his research could hopefully help better understand how human language originated and how children learn it, and help them in overcoming speech defects. So again, it's not just because we love dolphins and we want to know how they know language or teach them a different language and all that kind of stuff. It goes to, there are more broader implications that you can pull from this kind of research. And you may not see it immediately, like how does that relate to people at all? But then when you kind of look at it, you go, oh yeah, if we could understand how language is learned, and you imagine a baby learning language, I mean, they have no reference for it in the beginning. And so they have to piece all that together, like, well, this means that, or that means this, so it could help us learn more about ourselves as well. On top of dolphins just being amazing and super cool. So that's, I think I covered all the things that I wanted to. Like I said, there's probably more, but those are the biggies. And so you can imagine, again, this is all in captivity, and this is an artificial language, so they can also do that. They can do that. Well, what does that mean for them? Their intelligence within their own language in the regular world, right? What can they do that we don't know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is Koala Basin. And so if you like look up papers about it, or there's like popular science articles about the work that they did there, it's just really fascinating. So check it out if you can. So moving on from dolphin intelligence, we're going to move to seals and sea lions.
Yeah, pinniped. And actually it's funny because it actually dovetails really nicely, because a lot of what I am going to be talking about is in relation to learning, but actually a lot of, aside from just the basics of like, oh, hey, they can learn tasks, it's also a lot about language. So that was kind of interesting. So I'm going to kind of split this up just because it seems like a slightly more logical way to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about seals first and then sea lions. And obviously, I mean, for a lot of people, I'm sure you know that sea lions are one of the, especially California sea lions, are one of the most popularly used species in like aquariums and, sea life centers and stuff like that, and putting on displays and shows because they are very good at learning tasks.
Yeah, like if you go to an aquarium, it's bottlenose dolphins and California sea lions. Those are the main.
And a lot of that, yeah, exactly. A lot of that has to do with their trainability, basically. So the fact that they can not only learn these tasks, but they can learn to execute them correctly on demand, and usually with some level of consistency. So like they remember enough to know that this same thing today means the same thing it did yesterday. It means that I have to do the same thing at the show today that I did yesterday.
Right.
So that in itself is actually quite impressive to, when you think they're being asked to do these really, in a lot of ways compared to their normal behaviors, very inane tasks. Like, here, hold the ball and balance a ball on your nose. It's like,
that's where I was going to go. That's always like the thing where they're like,
right, the California sea lion, like, right. And it's like, they would never need to do that in reality, as far as we know. But the fact that they can remember that behavior, and actually one of the studies that I was looking at, they tested that in sea lions, and they have actually been shown to have long-term memory capabilities at least as long as several months, where they were shown that they could remember, quote unquote, remember the same tricks after, 3 to 4 months of not doing the tricks or not doing anything like those tricks. And they were asked to do that trick again, and without any prompting, they immediately repeated the trick that they had, performed those 3 to 4 months before.
I wonder how long that, I'm sure they probably haven't done it, but how long did it go?
I know. Well, that's the thing where I was like, oh, long-term memory. And I was like, oh, 3 to 4 months. That doesn't seem that long. But I guess in the context of what we're talking about, that is quite a long time when they're then being asked to do a bunch of other behaviors in between.
Right.
So like I said, I'm going to really talk about seals first. Although, actually, before I get into the seal part, since we are talking about memory, a nice little seal-line crossover. So there was actually a study done by the University of Southern Denmark that was done on 7 captive animals that included 4 South American sea lions, 2 harbor seals, and a gray seal. And so they were testing memory capabilities basically in these animals. So the animals were trained to take a particular action after being given a command, and then were trained to respond to a specific cue that indicated they had to repeat that previous action. So they trained them to do the action, then they trained them with a cue to, when I say this thing, that means you repeat what you just did, basically. So they're 2 separate training blocks, effectively. And not only did the animals respond correctly, but they could respond to the cue by repeating the task when they were ordered to do so. So it's like demonstrating that short-term memory where I did this thing just a couple minutes ago. Can I remember what I did without you giving me that same sequence of commands again? And you just give me the command saying repeat. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
So it's a slightly more abstract concept where they could do it if it, fetch the ball. I don't know what their commands were, but just say fetch the ball. And then the next command would be repeat. And they knew to still go fetch the ball. But then that would vary, depending on what the task was that they did before. So that was really cool. So they have been demonstrated to have both short-term and, at least for the sea lions, we know they do have some level of long-term memory when it comes to trained commands, which makes sense in terms of what they would need to remember in their native environment too. They'd have to remember certain strategies that they're not using every day in order to, say, catch fish or, forage in novel environments that they're not experiencing every single day. So getting into the seals, this was actually really interesting. So one of the coolest things, obviously, with seals is they are very intelligent. They're an apex predator. But one of the things that was really interesting is they've also been shown to identify and specifically target tagged fish species. So there are sometimes researchers will actually tag the fish in order to study the fish and the fish behavior, right? And what was interesting is they found that these tags will give off a little ping. And what they found was that seals were specifically targeting fish that had tags on them. And they think they were being attracted to the pings. And it was basically like I use this term in relation to deterrence, actually, but it's called a meal bell effect. Where basically it's like the sound is the association of ringing the bell, like come get food, here you go. And so they think that it's potentially related to that. But yeah, I guess they were actually, when they realized this was happening, they started looking at it more specifically, and it was like 90-something% of the time the seals would target the tagged fish versus the non-tagged fish.
Wow.
Which is pretty smart when you think about like trying to get a quick and easy meal and not expending a ton of energy. You go for the one that you already know is a fish, and it's giving off like the siren.
It's giving like, I'm a fish, here, eat me.
Right. Come get me. So yeah, that was very cool. And again, the fact that they learned that that's what that meant is that this is attached to a fish that then can be prey for me.
Right.
Now getting into the language part, this is super cool. So many of you may have already heard about the very well-known seal Hoover. His name was Hoover. I actually had heard of this, but I didn't remember that I had until I started reading about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, of course. I think I remember hearing about this in my behavioral ecology class. So he was a seal that was rescued by some Maine fishermen, so up on the northeast coast of the US, when he was just a pup. And he was housed at the Boston, New England Aquarium. And he, became their kind of resident seal. People would come to see him in the aquarium. And they realized that he was making some really weird sounds.
And yeah, I remember this now.
Yeah. So basically, he had learned to imitate human speech. And not only did he imitate human speech, but he imitated human speech with a Bostonian accent, which if any of you have heard one, it's pretty intense and it's pretty specific. So he actually became, this was in the 1970s. So I believe it was kind of first published about in like 1971. Became a huge attraction, obviously.
Yeah.
Everyone coming to see the talking seal, you know.
Well, can you imagine? So, like, if the seal is saying like bag, like we would say bag, but like in a Bostonian accent, it'd be like bag. Come get the bag.
Right. And I mean, he would apparently he would. Right. It's like sounds really weird. And apparently, not only was it just random words, but he would imitate actual like phrases like "Hello, how are you?" and like "What you doing?" and stuff like that. Now, again, there are YouTube videos, you can go look it up. It's a little, you know, like you need a little bit of interpretation there to be like, okay, these are actual words. But the fact that their physiology and their physiology of any sort of like vocal production is very different to ours. The fact that he was able to imitate speech closely enough that people could understand the words that he was specifically imitating was basically unheard of in any kind of pinniped up until that point.
Well, and even with dolphins and stuff, they're really good mimics. They can mimic certain sounds and things, but I don't think we have any that have really mimic speech. You know, it's like, oh, you made that whistle, or you made this other weird nouns, raspberry sounds and things like that, but not actually speaking.
Right. And so what was really neat about this, so like I said, obviously he became a legend, right? Like he was a huge celebrity. And yet they still didn't really understand how he was doing this. And they think that a lot of the words he picked up from those Maine fishermen who had actually rescued him as a pup.
When he was younger.
Learned from a very young age, right? So
because with people, you learn most when you're a sponge when you're younger. So I'm just the same
so it's
thing
like between like 0 and 5, I think, like you learn the majority of your language.
Yeah.
So again, that's potentially something that might have impacted that. What was cool about this is that in 2018 at the University of St. Andrews, which is where I went, so yay. And actually my old supervisor worked on this project, so it was super cool. They were like, well, actually, like no one's really followed up on this. Like, let's do a dedicated training study and investigate the ability of a harbor seal to learn human speech, right? In a more scientific setting. So they trained 3 seals in St. Andrews to copy tones. So like just sound tones. And they first used ones that were kind of within the known range of harbor seal vocalizations. Obviously they had fish rewards when they copied it correctly. So like I said, they started off training them to copy tones that were within their known vocal range. They then started kind of pushing them a little farther to copy unfamiliar frequencies. So like higher frequencies than they normally would be able to produce or would regularly use, as well as incorporating vowels and vowel sounds, which is apparently extremely difficult for animals to imitate, which I don't really know if I knew that, but apparently that's like exceptionally difficult for them to actually imitate, because it's also like a lot to do with the mouth shape and how you produce the sound using our mouth.
Right, because you say like mom versus ma'am versus, you know, you're changing where your lips are. So
exactly, it's more of a mouth movement than a vocal movement per se. So what was interesting about this is they didn't mimic the sounds perfectly, but it was within the significant range of basically, like they mimicked it closely enough that it was a significant result. So as like basically like a preliminary study. Yeah. And I mean, like, you know, obviously they weren't copying it, like they weren't repeating what they heard back per se, but it was similar enough that it was a striking result. Like they actually, I don't know if they were really expecting them to even be quite as closely mimicked as they were. And like I said, especially given the differences in physiology between seals and humans, the ability to produce a sound that is
anywhere close,
distinguishably trying to be that other sound, is pretty incredible. Yeah. So that was super cool. So they have quite a lot of ability to learn, and especially when it comes to vocalizations and sound. And like I said, they haven't really studied this a ton in harbor seals, but it does seem like they might actually be more capable of learning vocalization as well as specific like hand cues or verbal cues. They might actually be capable of mimicking sounds as well, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, interesting to look at the different, different species, right? Do sea lions do it better than or harbor seals do it better than this? And learn language versus, visual versus gestures versus acoustic.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, that's the thing, is just a lot of this stuff, like we haven't really studied in pinnipeds. Like I said, California sea lions are really the most studied because they're in captivity and they're regularly used for training purposes and for, show purposes and that type of thing. Like they're familiar with learning those types of cues and repeating the behaviors asked.
Right.
So now we're going to go on to sea lions, which we can wrap up pretty quick here. But like I said, so these guys are known for their ability to learn behaviors, and repeat them. And things like, like we talked about before, bobbing the ball on their nose, for example, like not only does that show that they can remember behaviors, but it also shows a huge amount of concentration ability, as well as the fact that they can apparently, and they will just randomly bob their heads to music, which I didn't know that they did. But apparently that also is like
that's awesome.
Kind of an like
out.
I've seen like parrots do that,
where
they're like jiving with the music, but apparently that's not something that all animals do.
It just goes to show that music is universal.
True
right?
story.
Feel
True
the beat.
story. Yep. So really the main thing that I want to talk about, like I said, we already discussed their long-term memory capabilities, but one study that was really interesting was done during the 2015 mass mortality event. So there were basically a bunch of California sea lions that were dying basically of emaciation. So they were starving in California. And so there were basically a bunch of dead animals lying on the beaches. And the scientists from the Vanderbilt University took the opportunity to study the brains. Because again, a lot of these animals are ones that are live, that are in captivity. We can't necessarily see what's going on inside. So they specifically were interested in researching their sensory cortex. So basically like their sensory capabilities, and specifically that would correspond to their whisker area, because they already know that that's very important for creatures like cats and mice. And I think especially in mouse models, they'd already shown that like they have an enlarged area of sensory capability that corresponds to their whisker region. And so basically they found exactly what they were looking for, which was the amount of space in the California sea lion brain that's dedicated to whisker sensation is basically the equivalent to the amount of our brain that's dedicated to our finger sensation. So it's hugely sensitive, and the brain, the amount of space that gets for the sea lion in their brain is pretty huge compared to a lot of other sensory locations, which makes sense. I mean, if you think about how finely we need to be able to feel just through our fingers, and how attuned we need to be to the sensations we're receiving from that, to not burn ourselves, to not hurt ourselves, to be able to, pick things up and not drop them. Anyone who's kind of, fallen asleep on their arm and then tried to go and pick something up right after, it's like you're clumsy, like you can't feel as well to hold on to those things. So that was basically kind of groundbreaking. They are now doing, I believe that was I think it was first published in like 2016 or 2017 was when the preliminary results of that were published. And so they found that the brains themselves of the California sea lions are about the size of a chimpanzee's brain. So one of the larger brains in the animal kingdom anyway. However, the actual folding within the brain was more similar to that of like dolphins and whales. So it does seem that, maybe marine mammals do actually have like a different type of folding within the brain that corresponds to something within the marine environment, or different sensations or learning that they would need to do to survive in that context.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of more folds means higher intelligence, basically, from a physical perspective.
Typically,
yeah. So more folds is better, but there's some other stuff with dolphins about structures that they have that we don't have, and what that means towards intelligence and stuff. So that's a good point, where the structure of the brain is very important to understand what we're seeing with all these different things that we see with this language and intelligence.
Yeah, super cool. So yeah, like I said, that was kind of the other thing, just aside from the learning ability and the long-term memory. And then there was just the last thing was just that there also have been examples of intelligence demonstrated in captive animals in California sea lions too. So there was a sea lion named Rio that was tested by researchers in the Long Marine Laboratory in California. And they were basically running mental agility tests on her, like testing her, you know, like you mentioned at the beginning, testing her quote unquote IQ. And they did actually prove that she could use logic to solve basic equations. So for example, an equation like if A equals B and B equals C, then what does A equal? Well, A also equals C. And so she was actually able to solve that problem, which again is a very abstract logic problem, if you think about it.
So if a fish equals a snail and a snail equals a bird, then a bird equals a fish.
Exactly. Yeah, and she was actually able to solve that. So
wow, that's cool.
Pretty intelligent. They're not just the ball balancing, funny. I don't know if any. This is going to date me, but I don't know if anyone ever watched the movie Andre the Seal.
Oh yeah.
No of it.
Yeah.
Even though he was a sea lion, so that always bugged me. But that's okay.
That's true. I didn't even.
Right?
I'm like, because I'm just like, yeah.
It bothered me even when I was like 10 and I first saw it. I'm like, well, that's not accurate. Yeah, but I was a nerd, so it's fine.
Oh, that's funny.
Anyway, that's what I have for seals and sea lions intelligence based on.
Cool. So Trevor has
tool use.
Yes.
So the bulk of it we'll be talking about sea otters, and then I'll mention a few callbacks that we kind of mentioned before as well, and some speculative tests of possible tool use in marine mammals. It's a whole thing of arguments of that's not a tool, and that's, you know.
Right, well, we'll talk about like what do you mean by tool?
Yeah.
What constitutes a tool? Yeah.
So, I mean, for example, what I'll be talking about is general use of objects in their environment for specific tasks. So I won't include like a nest, like, you know, maybe an otter might live in a nest, but that's not a tool in this scenario, versus what they do use, and most commonly are stones for tools. So they're in the Stone Age.
Like it.
So with the sea otters, they have really powerful jaws to get into their shelled prey, as in bivalves like oysters and clams, but they'll also use rocks to bash open these shelled animals. So I'm sure you've seen pictures of it somewhere, but what otters, primarily in California, will do is they'll actually rip off their prey item, say the clam, and then they'll have their rock anvil on their stomach, and they'll just bash it until the shell breaks.
They're bashing it on their chest or their stomach too, so it's kind of like, it seems like it might hurt.
Worse, yeah.
If you live in California, you see like on their stomach, that's probably what they're doing. Yeah, I mean, the test I was reading was, on average, it takes about 35 blows to open a mussel shell. Yeah,
Jeez,
so
that's a lot of work.
You could crack open with your tooth, but if it's too hard and it might hurt, you could use a rock to the shell to get going.
Wow, and they have to eat a lot. They eat like a quarter of their body weight a day or something ridiculous. So that's a lot of banging.
Also, that's a lot of energy expenditure. Right? I mean, that would be like quite, you know, that would take quite a lot of energy to do that.
Yeah.
And what's probably even more energy is what they also do is they can use what they call a rock hammer, so they can carry the rock with them underwater. And if there's a snail or an abalone, is their common one, stuck on a rock, they can bash it underwater to pry it off the rock.
Yeah, because I mean, when they cement pretty well.
Cement, yeah. Some of them actually just bash it, and until it's open, then they'll just like rip the meat out and bring it up to the top. But
either way.
Did you know that sea otters have little pockets under their?
They do. They hide stuff for later.
I did not know that.
So gnarly.
Well, yeah, they tuck them in there, and then they can swim back up to the surface.
Yeah. I guess they'll actually put like rocks in their pockets and then go down to the water and bash them.
Again, that also just goes to show how important pockets are, right? There should be pockets.
And I'm just saying, like, they have the coolest coat, and the coat has pockets.
Right.
Like,
just saying.
Done.
So I guess with the statistics too, if you look at it, it's not really used in Alaska because the stuff they're going after is more fishy, so they don't need to necessarily use tools much.
I didn't think about
but
that.
in California, there's so many bivalves and shelled animals that they bash open. They'll do it with urchins too, but
right. I would assume that the urchins don't take nearly as much energy to crush.
Right, and they have little dexterous paws too, so they can just kind of
right.
Yeah,
if you get down to the bottom of the urchin, just the hole at the bottom, you can probably just
rip
it.
From the stats that I was reading, they saw of this particular populations in Alaska, only 1% of diets actually had tool use.
Huh.
And then in California, Central California, I think it was 16% of diets had tool use.
Wow.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah. So that includes if you catch a fish, you're not going to use a tool.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I guess it does depend on the amount of that particular item that you're using in your diet, and then where you are as to how much of that you would actually be eating.
Right.
They also found in California 80% of abalone shells that they found, or alive or living or dead, like discarded shells or still in rocks. 80% of them had marks indicative of sea otters bashing them with rocks.
Wow.
To try to open them up.
So like you'd expect that to see that on the ones that are left out, are dead. But the fact that there's some that are still surviving, are like, I've been hit by otters so many times, but I'm still here. Pretty impressive.
It is. But I mean, stones are not the only tool that they've identified with sea otters as well. They use kelp as a tool, they've determined as well. So in that scenario, they wrap themselves in kelp.
Oh, right.
And then they don't drift away if they don't want to.
So they don't float away into the ocean.
Yeah. Or if mom wants to say, stay here for the pup, she'll go wrap them. But I guess they also will wrap crab that they catch in kelp to immobilize them while they eat other food.
That's smart.
Oh, so this is like, save it, like, here, you just stay here for a little bit while I eat this other thing, and then I'm going to eat you. Wow, that poor crab.
Yeah.
Ingenious.
Yeah, they're pretty smart. So, I mean, that's what they do. And I'm going to be basing the rest of this off of one paper I was reading. It was simply titled Tool Use in Aquatic Animals.
Okay.
I like it.
Good,
They've identified 30 species of animals that for sure use tools, plus more that could use tools.
Right.
Yeah. So like they've identified sea urchins technically use tools, meaning they can put things on their spines to protect them from UV rays.
Whoa.
They consider that a tool.
Well, yeah, if there's specific,
again,
like if you're specifically putting something that is not normally on you
for a specific purpose,
some purpose,
to prevent harm. Yeah.
Right. Not just like, I look pretty, but I guess that's also a tool. I need to look beautiful.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I'll talk about that one with the river dolphins too, but let's see. So we have previously talked about mud plume feeding. I think Cindy talked about that. And then we've mentioned humpback bubble net feeding. Those are considered tool use as well in marine mammals. So essentially what those are, surrounding a school of fish with bubbles or mud, acting as a net, and then the animals will surge through and get the fish.
And I think that's the important thing we wanted to bring up here is that, when you think of a tool, you're like, oh, I have a hammer or a nail or something physical that you're handling. But a tool is anything that helps, that's not normally associated with whatever behavior you're trying to do, and you're using that to get something out of it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be something physical. It's just what we normally think of. Again, our intelligence is you're using a tool, tool use in chimpanzees is because they, take the like piece of grass and they stick it in the termite hill and they pull it out and it's got termites all over it and things like that. But there's so many other things that you could use as a tool. You just have to open your mind as to what that means.
Yep.
In terms of physical tools, we have the sea otters, like I just mentioned. And then in the previous podcast, one or two podcasts ago, we talked about the bottlenose dolphin specific feeding strategies. There's a population in Shark Bay, Australia, which you can learn more about this in a podcast, but they'll rip off sponges from the seafloor and basically use those as protection when they forage in the sandy, rocky bottom. So that's
cool.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because for that one, it was within familial lines, right? There's a certain portion of the population versus sea otters in California. I'm assuming it's pretty ubiquitous, right? Everybody uses
it is
that
now,
tool.
but the mothers are seen teaching their kids how to do it. But when
but that spread through all of the mothers versus just like certain family lines, so where does that
population in Shark Bay for that dolphin? So
so like what stops that from spreading through the entire population versus only being in certain parts? Maybe just some degree, some animals are like, oh, we could do that. I think that's stupid. I'm not going to do that. And they decide not to do that. That's an intelligence as well, of deciding whether or not to take on a certain thing. And that, just briefly, they've just been documenting trap feeding in humpback whales up here, which is not a tool because it's their own body that they're using, but they come up to the surface and they just open their mouths and they just sit there and let the fish will try to take shelter within the mouth, and then they close it and they eat it.
Smart.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But they're seeing more and more individuals doing that behavior now. And so how that's spreading, and we talked about this in another podcast, how does that spread through the population? So it's just very interesting.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
I can briefly talk about potential tool uses too that haven't been proven and are still speculative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This paper that I'm referencing a lot, they actually use the water medium as a potential tool use, like when dolphins squirt water to potentially move or the rocky bottom. That could be a potential tool use, but it's under.
I could see that.
If you're like moving the substrate to be able to get to something.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a speculative thing. Same thing with the orcas in the Antarctic when they all come and make a wave and knock the seals off.
You know what? I think that would be a tool because you're using the medium to create a wave.
Again, like you mentioned with the physical tool, it's not a physical tool, but it's still a tool.
Right. Well, and again, with cetaceans and pinnipeds and stuff, they don't have hands to be able to grab a tool.
Yeah.
Right. So there's other ways that you can manipulate. It's basically manipulating the environment, and that I would say is definitely.
It's actually pretty smart.
Yeah.
Especially when you live in water, like, using what you exist within to your advantage. And to
understand the physics of that, like knowing if I do this, it'll create this wave, and that will then do this and knock the seal off, and then I can eat it. Right. It's this to this to this to that.
Yeah. Very cool.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
They're smart. I guess the last one I'll mention too is in the Amazon River, the river dolphins there are frequently seen with sticks or leaves or debris in their mouth. And this often leads to male aggression on each other when that happens. It's almost always the males that have these sticks. So now it's a possibility that are they using these sticks as a mating
sexual display?
Like how great I am.
Right. Yeah, well, and in most mammal species, the males, any bird species, most species, honestly, the boys are the ones that have to look all pretty and be all magnificent. Look at a peacock. The beautiful peacock are male peacocks. The females are brown and kind of nondescript. So it's always the males generally that have to do that kind of look at me, I'm so awesome and amazing. So just because we haven't seen it in cetaceans doesn't mean it doesn't happen somewhere.
Right.
Very cool. Maybe it's something new. Maybe they're just like, wow, I put the stick in my mouth once and I look amazing. And somebody decided you look amazing. And then it becomes a thing. I mean, that's how it works in human society, right? Do like a side
called a trend,
right? these
it's like bell bottoms,
trending.
Right? Bell bottoms are hot, man.
Right.
Oh, but wait, they're not. Now skinny jeans are in like that. And that's the thing. It'll be interesting to see too if they can actually study that for a little bit more time and to see if the type of display that they're using, if that is what it is with the river dolphins, if that modifies or changes or augments or something, like if that starts to get more elaborate or changes. It'd be kind of fascinating.
They did say it was a year-round thing, but it had peaks in the spring, I believe.
Okay. Well, I mean, you got to look good the entire time and just maybe ump your game when it's natural mating time. But like the whole time, they have memories. We talked about that they can remember things, so I remember you last week and last month when you looked pretty cool and you still look good. So, all right. Very cool. Well, yeah.
The last thing I'll clarify too, dolphins and seals and sea lions, they use toys all the time in the wild. Right. And, they give them in their enclosures too. Like dolphins will frequently grab a stick, drop it, everybody goes grabs it. Yay,
we would watch they play sargassum tag all the time in the Bahamas.
Yeah, there you go.
Where they grab sargassum and then they swim around with it and they put it in their dorsal fin, they put it in their fluke, and then they pass it off and they drop it and another dolphin picks it up. So they're definitely playing with an object. That's
your own interpretation of a tool again. If it's a social necessity.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. What's interesting. Yeah, it's a good point. Like, is a tool that's something in a social context the same as what we think of as tool as in trying to get food? That's almost all of these are related to either attracting a mate or finding food, but
Right.
could tool use be put into that social context? I would hazard to say perhaps so.
Perhaps.
I mean, the sargassum has nothing to do with friendship.
But it's,
apparently
again,
it does.
it's like when you're, I guess you could relate it to, if you know, in a human context, it's similar to saying, like, you know, play is a tool for building your social communities as a kid. Like, the more you play and learn how to play with other kids, that's an incredibly important social tool.
And if you don't learn that, you have problems when you're an adult. And the same thing will happen in dolphin society. We see them, you know, the kids are learning, the cats are learning what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and all that stuff.
Right.
So you're right.
So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, to that
And this
degree,
is all this what we've seen too. Who knows what's happening when we're not around?
Right.
This is only what they're letting us see.
Right. We have, and I'll mention that sponging thing, but they have seen one humpback dolphin do that before as well. In one case. So what other species are doing that? What are they doing that we haven't seen before? You know, we just never know. But potential tool use.
You know, I think we tend to think like, oh, if they've only used it once, then it was just kind of random thing, and it's not a real tool use. Well, what if it is? Like, they did do it for that purpose. Wouldn't that still just be a tool use that they used for that one time and then decided they didn't like it, so they're not doing it anymore?
Right.
I mean, where do you differentiate between this accidental thing that happened versus a purposeful? And I think that's where they say, like, well, we need to see it more than once, because hard for us to be able to determine the difference between those two. But so there's lots of things that we can think about as tools, and it's a good point to end on, in that we need to broaden our ideas of what intelligence is and how we define it and how we figure out what that means. Like, how do we make those tests to determine how intelligent something is? And there was I know I can't remember the name of the book. Do you remember the book, the book that I gave you to read?
No, I was trying to.
Do we know how smart? Are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? It's something like that by Franz de Waal. And it's a great book if you're interested in this kind of stuff, where it basically goes a lot into that, like making sure that you're asking the question, like the chimp and the elephant and the snake, you know, trying to go climb a tree, right? Are you asking the question in a correct way that the intelligence of the animal could be presented, versus asking an elephant to climb a tree, which they can't do because it's physically impossible. So that's a really great book if you're interested in that. And it's really well written and goes into a lot of figuring that out. How do we ask these questions? So check it out if you can. All right, well, that ends it for this week. We'll be back next week with something. Not sure, we'll figure it out. But we'll see you next time, and have a wonderful week.
Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.